I hosted a podcast for 6 years, and I realize now that most people misunderstand the true value it brings to your business. Yes, it's fun jamming with successful entrepreneurs, and it did help us get clients on the road to selling our business. And no, it's not too late to start. You would be missing out on what I see is the real hidden benefit of podcasting: valuable relationships. Podcasts are definitely easier to produce than long-form videos or writing, just like talking to a regular person. And that's why people love them. For listeners, it's the closest they can get to actually hanging out with you. And that's why I think they're still popular despite all the super high production content that's out there today. And I know this because I feel a similar connection to my favorite podcasters like Joe Rogan or Tim Ferriss, and it almost feels in a weird way like I'm friends with them, even though I've never actually met them in real life. For you as a podcaster, that connection to listeners is massively valuable. They're the first to buy your offers, and when you get them on sales calls, they're the easiest people to close. But that's not even the biggest benefit to podcasting. I quickly learned that by interviewing successful people, I was creating a similar relationship with the people I interviewed. And when we kept chatting after the recording, they were super receptive to future marketing collaborations and any way we could help each other. And I'll explain how that works in a second, but I'm also going to get into everything you need to start, grow, and systematize your podcast. Everything you need to get started, getting high-profile guests before you have an audience, making your podcast the most interesting it can be, systematizing your production and back-end processes, finally leveraging guest relationships for future collabs. Starting a podcast is pretty simple, and there are tons of great videos on this, so I'm just going to share what I did personally. My podcast was about selling on Amazon because my target clients were Amazon sellers. They pretty much all want to make more money and be location independent, so after 5 entire minutes of deep consideration, I chose the name Actualize Freedom. At first, the episodes were all just me teaching stuff, but I soon realized the power of interviewing people, so we switched to interviews only. And it's just a lot easier to prep when someone else is providing the value. I bought a Yeti Blue microphone for $130. The sound is great and it plugs directly into my computer via USB. Joe Rogan uses the Shure SM7B, but that requires a lot of extra gear and is only marginally better sounding. I record solo audio-only podcasts with the free program Audacity, and if it's a video podcast with a guest, I use Squadcast, which unlike Zoom, saves the recordings of you and your guests locally, so even if the connection cuts out, you still have uninterrupted recordings. Then I upload the podcast to Simplecast, which distributes it to Spotify, Apple, and most other podcast platforms. But you can't have a good podcast without high-profile guests. Ideally, people you also want to create these beneficial relationships with. But it's super hard to get them to agree to be on your podcast, right? You gotta send an email to someone who knows them so they can send a DM to them, who then calls someone who actually knows them, who goes over to the house and calls in a favor. Dude, why don't you just send them a DM? Yeah, you literally send them a DM. Guarantee you'll be surprised how many guests just say yes without even asking any questions. Even guests you'd assume are way out of your league. Kind of like how my fiance is way out of my league. So a few tips for DMing podcast guests. Number 1, DM them on the platform they are most active on. Number 2, have an optimized profile. When they click on your profile, it should be clear that you are a creator profile. There should be as much social proof as possible. If you're on Instagram, that's your bio and story highlights. On Facebook, that's your cover photo, pinned photos. You get the idea. Number 3, be clear and concise. They don't know you. They get a ton of DMs from actual idiots and scammers, so you definitely want to do the opposite of what those idiots do. Here's a good template you can use. Hi Barack, would love to have you on the Actualize Freedom podcast if you're down. For example, we've had on Donald Trump, Jennifer Lopez, and we'll distribute it to our email list and socials. So it should be super short while still convincing them that it's worth their time and making it really easy for them to say yes. Now, how do we make sure your podcasts are actually good and make people come back, but also create that deep relationship with the listener? You will get better with more reps, but here are a few key things to focus on. Do some really basic research on each guest and just write down your own curious questions as you're researching them. If you're genuinely curious about the questions you're asking, chances are that's going to translate over to your audience as well. They can feel that. At this point, it's also a good idea to come up with your future collaboration ideas, but we'll get to that part in a bit. Before hitting the record button, you're going to want to chat with them for 5 or 10 minutes just to build some rapport so you're both really comfortable with each other before you actually start the podcast. And then I always ask them a question. What are the 3 subtopics about your expertise that you feel the most comfortable talking about right now? Like, where can you provide the most value? And that just gives me a good base to go off of in case I get lost and have to steer the conversation somewhere else. It's your job as the interviewer to keep the guest interesting. A great podcast is useful, tells their story, and flows at a pace like a fascinating conversation with a new friend. If your guest goes on a tangent that starts to become uninteresting or rambly, then shift the direction by asking them a totally different question. So if they're they're not telling an interesting story or saying something useful, then you want to keep the pace going by shifting the conversation. A good system will make everything super easy and repeatable. Here's how I systematize my podcast. I set up a Calendly event called Podcast Guest Booking that also collects their bio, their ideas they want to share on the podcast, their marketing channels that they're willing to share the podcast on. And when they book, it triggers a Zapier automation that sends the guest an onboarding email, creates a Google Drive folder for the episode, and then creates a task template in your task management software of choice. And for the editing and publishing process, don't follow mine exactly. You're going to want to build your own checklist based on what social media platforms you publish on, your own editing processes, whether you're working with an editor or doing it yourself. Just use mine as a kind of framework and then build yours progressively as you figure your own process out. But you want to have some kind of checklist. And once you have that finished checklist, you're ready to pass it off to someone else as your podcast grows and you have more money coming in. And now the most valuable part of having a podcast. The relationships you create with your guests can be super valuable and beneficial for both of you, but only if you're not a freaking weirdo about it. I'm guessing you don't plan on interviewing idiots, so they'll be wise to any pushy, salesy garbage that you try to do, so don't be that guy. When you're talking about ways you can collaborate, it should feel like two buddies just hanging out and asking how they can help each other. That's why it's best to have this conversation immediately after recording the podcast, when you're still riding that wave of flow and rapport. Trust me, they are much more likely to be receptive to collaborations at this point because humans have this natural need to reciprocate. If you brought them onto your podcast and you're doing something good for them, they are naturally much more open to doing something for you. And use your social intuition. Don't be the weird guy who like, I did this for you and now you have to do this for me, because people can feel that and it just ruins the whole thing. So as you're preparing for the interview, you should have come up with a few ideas for marketing collaborations that fit with their current marketing effort. Here are a few examples. Tamara T has a great YouTube channel and a course teaching how to sell on Amazon. So I offered to create a full masterclass for her course members about listing optimization. Then I got her on our affiliate program, so she made a commission on anyone who bought our services. The AM/PM podcast was looking for more guest experts for the roundup videos. That got us featured a few times with powerful backlinks for our SEO. But most of the collaborations we did were guest post swaps for SEO, because that was our main marketing strategy, and it was a really good way for us to get relevant backlinks to our site and grow our domain authority. But the point here is working out a marketing collab that works for both of you, and it typically takes a little bit of back and forth and coming up with some ideas and just jamming on the spot. It's actually one of my podcast guests that ended up buying my agency when I went to sell it. And actually, when I announced that I sold my agency, one of my other podcast guests sent me a DM and told me I should have offered him the business as well. So podcasting is super valuable, guys. If you want to check out the 4 pillars that grew my agency to $100,000 per month, check out this video right here.